Welcome to the lecture 22 of the course CS213 Object Oriented Programming of the Kohat University of Science and Technology. In this lecture we will continue our discussion of the basic GUI components from our lecture 21. In our previous lecture we talked about the basic GUI programming concepts, what graphical user interfaces are, simple GUI based input output, and specifically we talked about JFrame, JPanel and JLabel, and we looked at some examples of how we can add components to our JFrames and JPanel, how can we redesign them, and we looked at some of the properties of these containers and components. We also looked at an example of how we can add functionality to our components. In this lecture we will look at using the layout managers, maybe custom painting and graphics. The material can be found in chapter 12 of the book, as well as some of the tutorials that you can find online. Using layout managers. Layout managers arrange GUI components in a container for presentation purposes. They help us to present our components properly and with layout managers. For example, if we do not use layout manager and if we try to resize our maybe a form, then we can see that if there are components within the form, this is how it might affect the resizing of that form. The other components, they are not, we are losing the context of how do we want to display these components on our form. So for example, we have increased the size of the form, the rest of the form has increased, but the components they remain at their own places, that the size of the components has not increased. Similarly, if we are trying to decrease the size of our form, then we can see that the size of the form has decreased and it is overlapping the other components and we are not able to see them properly. If we use layout managers, then resizing of our form may be not an issue, and we can see that with the extension of the form of or with the reduction on the form, the components are modified accordingly. And this was the original form, and we tried to change the size of the form, and we can see the advantage of using layout managers. Get a layout specification as input. Recalculate the positions and sizes of the child widgets after each container resizing, as we can see in this example. Support for resizing different screens, possibly even different devices. As we can see that we are able to resize properly with the help of layout manager. We can also have different layouts for different screens. Maybe if you are developing applications for different devices, then the layout managers will help you to design different interfaces for different devices and different screens. How can we create the layout manager? We implement the layout manager interface. Select the layout manager by setting the layout property. For example, we have a container, maybe a pen, and we want to set the layout of this container to flow layout. We will see what different kinds of layouts we have, and we will see examples of those layouts. But this example shows us how we can set the layout of a certain pen or container. Specify layout with extra parameters when adding widgets to your graphical user interface. For example, if you are adding other components to your container, then you can set the parameters accordingly. For example, we are adding a button 1 at a certain position to our container, then this is the syntax for adding a button to our container. These are the different Subclasses of the layout manager class. We have a border layout, box layout, flow layout, maybe a grid layout, and these can help in composition with the container class. And we'll see examples of these as how we can implement these and create different layouts in our applications. For example, the border layout places components in up to 5 areas: top, bottom, left, right, and center. These areas are specified by the border layout constants. For example, if we provide a page start argument, it will add the component to the start of the page. If you add a page end argument, it will add the component to the end of the page. Line start will add the component to start of the line. Line end will add the component to the end of the line, and center will add the component to the center of the line or our container. This is how we can code for adding these different kinds of layouts to our container. So we have initialized a container and we want to add components. To this container in different layouts or at different positions. Then we can use the layout manager. In this case, the border layout. We have initialized a button object with some text, and if we add this button to our container, this form maybe, then we can use this code pen.add button border layout page start. This will create a border layout and add a button at the start of this page or this form. Similarly, we can do this for the rest of these components or buttons. For example, button 3 is added to the start of the line by calling or passing this argument to the add method. Button border layout dot line start. These are constants that we can use as to where do we want to put our buttons on the form. This will ensure that no matter how we drag or change the size of this form, this button will remain at their positions. All extra, if there is any extra space, that will be at the center of the form, otherwise, and the buttons or any other layouts will be added to the borders of the form. There might be alternate ways of writing this code. We have used this one, but we can also use other forms of code which may or may not work, may be valid, but might be error prone. Flow layout, on the other hand, places components in a row sized at their preferred size, arranges widgets over several lines from left to right, with top to bottom line breaks, just like text. With the flow layout, we can set the layout of our components in the form of text, like from left to right or top to bottom, like we write text. When the edge of the container is reached, components continue to display on the next line. As we will see in the example, for example, the default for a JPanel is, if we are adding two buttons or gadgets to our panel, for example, by default it follows the flow layout pattern, and the components are centered, as we can see. So as long as we keep adding these components, and if there is space on this panel, buttons will be added to this. For example, as we can see, button 1, button 2, like a text, when the line ends, the next line, the next button goes to the next line, and similarly, since this button is too long for this line, it is added at the following line, and the buttons are aligned centrally. and there is 5 pixels of space between these two buttons, as horizontally as well as vertically. The syntax of flow layout, if for example if you want to change the default alignment, we can do that by passing the flow layout right, flow layout left to the flow layout constructor. So if you want to set the layout to new flow layout right, we can do this by passing this argument, the static argument, to the flow layout constructor, and we can add. Now the buttons are added towards the right side of this form, as we can see. To look at an example of how we can use the border layout frame, we create a class border layout frame that extends the JFrame. Now you can name it anything, but since we are trying to show an example of the border layout through this frame, that is why we have named it as border layout frame. We have a bunch of buttons that we want to add to our frame, and those buttons have some text on top of them. One would be to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, and one would be at the center. Basically what we want to do with this example is, and this is an example from your book, that when we click on a button it should disappear. Now that is relevant since we are trying to show the example of the layout manager, but as we can see that this is a border layout where buttons are added to the sides and the center. If we click on one of the buttons, that button is hidden, and that is what we want to do with this code. Now in the constructor of the border layout frame, we assign a title to the frame, and we create an object of the border layout with a 5 on 5 pixels gaps, and we set the layout of our frame to that object. Now we have a bunch of buttons. The names of these buttons are taken from this array, and what we want is we want to go through the array, and whatever the number of buttons there are, we want them to add to our frame, and there is some action associated to each of the button. The action listener interface has been implemented by this frame, and we would go to the action listener as to see what action is being performed by each button or when we click each button. But this code or these statements show us how we can add these buttons to the different sides of our frame. So the button 0 will be added to the north of the frame, border layout dot north. Now this is, and this button 1 will be added to border layout south. Button 2 will be added to the border layout east. Button 3 will be added to the border layout west side of our frame, and button 4 will be added to the center of our frame. This is how you can add buttons or any components to the different sides of our frame. The action performed event or the action performed method that is implemented by each of these components. Let's say what should happen is when we click on a button, the visibility of that button becomes false, so it should disappear, otherwise it should appear on the panel. In the main method, we select an object of our frame that will initialize the object when we run the program. This will be the default size, and we will be able to see our frame once we run the program. And if you remember, the set default close operation was when we want the form to be exited when the user closes the form. So if we run this code, although we have seen how it works, we can see that the idea is that we can add components to the different sides of our or the borders of our form using the border layout manager. Similarly, to look at this flow layout frame, we have imported the required libraries. We have a flow layout frame. We create a flow layout frame as a subclass of the JFrame class, and we want to add buttons to our frame again. So if we have a look at what we want to achieve through this code, we just want to have buttons on our frame if you want to see it, and when we click on the button, the relevant action should be performed. So the clicking on left shifts all the buttons to the left side of the frame, clicking on center shifts or aligns the buttons in the center, and clicking on right aligns the buttons on the right side of the frame. And we are using the flow layout for this example. This text, when we send to the super, it will be shown in the title of your frame. If you have noticed it, this will be shown in the title of your frame. We have initialized the different objects for we are using buttons, so we have initialized the objects for our buttons, for our layout, and for the container where we want to add these buttons and show the layout, display the layout. So the layout has been set to the flow layout. The container will get the content pane of our frame. The left button will be added to the left side of the with the text left, and the actional, we are using anonymous class over here, or inner class over here. We will be discussing we'll be discussing inner classes and anonymous classes in our future lecture. But at the moment, what we are trying to achieve over here is we want to implement an action listener that shifts the buttons towards the left when we click on the left button. Same will be done for the center button and for the right button. We have created an object of our flow layout frame with these size and visibility is set to true, and the close operation should exit the application. We'll be looking at the inner classes and the anonymous classes in the future lectures, but we can assume that when we click the button, then the appropriate action on that button should be performed. For example, when we click on the right button, this line creates the button, and the button is added to the layout. Now if we look at the order of these buttons, the first one will be added to at the leftmost position of the layout, since we are following a flow layout, and in flow layout the buttons will keep adding until there is space on our frame, and it will go to the next line once there is no space in the same line. So this will come towards the start of the line, the next one will be the next in position in the line, and the last one will be, or the third one will be last in the position of the line. So follows the order as we do with the text, and we saw how it is working. Like this arrangement of these buttons is thanks to the flow layout in this order.